In April 1199, King Philip II of France reportedly thanked God when he heard that his great rival had perished. The mighty Richard the Lionheart, famed for his exploits on crusade and his ferocity in war, met a fate that many chroniclers found surprisingly anticlimactic. Far from falling in a grand battle, Richard was mortally wounded during a minor siege in rural France. In early 1199, Richard was in France reclaiming lands seized by Philip during his absence on the Third Crusade and subsequent captivity. By March, his campaign brought him to the Limousin region of Aquitaine, where a local uprising demanded the king's attention. A vassal of Richard's, the Viscount of Limoges, had rebelled, so Richard moved to crush the revolt, laying siege to a small castle called Chalus-Chabrol. This was a tiny, lightly defended fortress. Later accounts even called it virtually unarmed, hardly a challenge for a veteran crusader king. Why Richard bothered personally leading his forces at this siege has become a point of debate over the centuries. According to some chroniclers, a local peasant had recently unearthed a treasure trove of Roman gold, and the greedy king demanded the loot as his right. When the castle's lord refused, Richard besieged the stronghold in pursuit of the newly unearthed wealth. Other historians, however, argue that Richard was simply securing control of this strategic area and punishing a rebellious vassal, with the treasure story likely a later embellishment. Either way, by late March 1199, Richard found himself fully invested in the siege of a minor castle, expecting an easy victory. Little did he know this minor siege would become one of the most important events in medieval history. Legend holds that Richard, ever bold, grew careless during the siege. On the evening of March 26, 1199, the king took a relaxed walk around the castle walls without donning his chainmail armor. He was surveying the defenses up close, accompanied by a mercenary captain, and not expecting any serious danger. The siege was nearly won. The garrison was small, and Richard treated it almost like a casual outing. At that moment, the history of England, France, and Europe as a whole would change forever. A defender on the ramparts loosed a crossbow, and the bolt caught Richard in his left shoulder, near the neck. The king staggered back, the missile lodged deep. One colorful account even claims the crossbowman used a frying pan as a makeshift shield while taking the shot, underscoring the improvised nature of the castle's defense. Richard and his men at first shrugged off the wound. After all, it seemed a minor injury and not life-threatening. The king had survived countless battles and injuries. By some reports, he even joked about the crossbow hit. He was, after all, a true warrior king, the kind that wouldn't be seen for much longer, and he couldn't show weakness. Confident, he had the bolt removed and continued directing the assault on the lightly defended castle. Within a day or two, the castle fell to Richard's forces, essentially resolving the minor siege. But Richard's own ordeal had only just begun. What initially looked like a superficial wound soon turned into something much worse. Medieval medicine being what it was, the injury to Richard's shoulder became infected in the days after the castle's capture. The wound darkened and festered, and those around the king realized that gangrene had set in. In an age without antibiotics, such an infection in that area of his body was almost a guaranteed death sentence. The once invincible Lionheart watched as his strength ebbed. Over the next 10 days, Richard's condition worsened steadily. The king, who was only 41 years old, now understood the wound was mortal and began to settle his affairs. From his camp at Chalus, Richard sent word to his mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, who rushed to be by his side. In the early evening of April 6, 1199, King Richard perished. The mighty warrior king who had been feared and respected throughout Europe and the Middle East alike was felled by a common infection in a remote corner of France. According to chronicle accounts, Richard remained lucid to the end despite his pain. It's said that as he lay dying, he expressed regret for his past misdeeds and cruelties while on campaign. In a customary medieval gesture, Richard's body was divided for burial. His entrails were interred at the foot of the walls of Chalus, which some view as a token of contempt for the revolt there. His heart was sent to Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, and the rest of his body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou at the feet of his father's tomb. One of the most dramatic subplots of Richard's death involves the very man who fired the fatal bolt. Who was this crossbowman, and what became of him? The chronicles offer slightly different versions. With Chalus Castle taken and Richard now dying, the king ordered that the sniper responsible be found and brought before him. Contemporary sources variously name the culprit as Pierre Bazile, Jean Sabraz, or even Bertrand de Gourdon. Several accounts agree he was just a youth who had taken a lucky shot from the walls. Though all accounts agree that he was young, his specific age varies wildly. As the story goes, the captive was dragged before the ailing king, defiant but scared. In one telling, the young crossbowman confessed that he had acted out of revenge, shouting that Richard had slain his father and 2 brothers. He fully expected to be executed on the spot for striking down the Lionheart. What followed next became the stuff of legend. Summoning the last of his strength, King Richard didn't seek vengeance on his attacker. Instead, he chose the path of mercy, and before a gathering of his knights, Richard forgave the crossbowman for the deed. According to this account, he even gifted him a large sum of money to move on with his life. It was an extraordinary act of clemency from a king known for his ruthless temper. Richard perhaps saw it as a final chivalric deed, a way to leave the world honorably and atone for past sins. However, this wouldn't be a medieval tale without a dark twist. Richard's generous pardon was immediately undermined after his death. No sooner had the Lionheart drawn his last breath than his loyal retainers sought revenge on the man who caused it. According to some, it was his knights themselves who did it, to preserve the king's honor. In other accounts, it was Richard's fearsome mercenaries, who were eager to get their hands on the wealth that had been bestowed to the youth. Whatever the case, it appears that despite Richard's uncharacteristic act of clemency, the crossbowman didn't escape his fate. In the aftermath of 1199, Richard the Lionheart's death quickly took on symbolic significance. To his enemies, it was divine justice. Philip of France rejoiced, seeing providence in the fall of his most dangerous foe. To his admirers, it was a tragic, almost storybook end. One chronicle mournfully observed that the lion was slain by the ant, encapsulating the irony that a great warrior king was slain by a lucky crossbow bolt. Indeed, the contrast was dramatic. Richard had survived pitched battles, crusades, and captivity, only to be done in by a minor wound from a common soldier. This sense of the mighty, brought low by the trivial, made Richard's death a popular tale for storytellers in subsequent centuries. Over time, embellishments and theories sprouted around the event. Some folk tales whispered that the arrow was poisoned to explain how such a formidable warrior succumbed to a single hit. Speculation ran rampant that the French king may have played his part in this underhanded act, though modern scholars have found no evidence of this. Medical analysis today indicates Richard died of sepsis from the gangrenous wound, not an exotic poison. The 12 days between his injury and death gave ample time for infection to spread in an era with no antibiotics, making the official cause, gangrene or blood poisoning, wholly believable. The idea of a poisoned bolt is viewed as a later romantic embellishment, unsupported by contemporary evidence. In truth, infection was a common killer in medieval warfare. A scratch could turn deadly without proper care, let alone a deep puncture wound. Richard's death, then, was not miraculous or mysterious, but a typical outcome for an untreated battlefield injury. The real mystery, perhaps, is why Richard was there at all, exposing himself to danger at a petty siege. Was it hubris? Overconfidence? Desperation for treasure? Historians continue to debate the king's mindset in those fateful moments. What is clear is that Richard's demise changed the course of history. His brother John inherited the throne, and the Plantagenet dominions soon began to unravel without the Lionheart's strong arm. And in case you doubt the history-altering effect of this one single crossbow bolt, remember that John signed the Magna Carta. Though this is speculation, I suspect that Richard the Lionheart, known for his fierce independence and military prowess, would have never signed the Magna Carta. His reign was defined by absolute power and unyielding authority, leaving little room for legal constraints. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. Elizabeth Bathory, a 17th century Hungarian countess, is enshrined in legend as one of history's most prolific monsters. The lurid tales surrounding her have made Bathory infamous as the Blood Countess. However, modern historical research paints a very different picture. Increasingly, scholars are disputing the traditional narrative and suggest that Bathory may have been the victim of a conspiracy. Under this theory, she was framed by powerful political and family rivals who stood to benefit from her downfall. Bathory lived in a time of intense turmoil in the Kingdom of Hungary. The early 1600s saw Hungary split into factions amid ongoing wars with the Ottoman Empire and the Counter-Reformation conflicts in Europe. Since the disastrous Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary had effectively been divided into three parts. The western and northern regions were under Habsburg rule and were known as Royal Hungary. The central portion was under direct Ottoman occupation, and the Eastern Principality of Transylvania, which was semi-autonomous. This meant that Hungarian politics were a high-stakes game involving the Catholic Habsburg Empire, the Protestant nobility of Transylvania, and the ever-present threat of the Ottomans. The Habsburgs were staunch Catholics intent on reimposing Catholicism, while many Hungarian nobles, including the Bathory family, were Protestant and resisted Habsburg religious control. In this climate, accusations and scandals could be weaponized to eliminate political opponents. At the time of Elizabeth Bathory's alleged crimes, her cousin György Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary, the king's representative. King Matthias II, an Austrian Catholic Habsburg ruler, sat on the Hungarian throne. Both had vested interests in curbing the influence of powerful nobles in this unstable realm. Bathory's own nephew, Prince Gabriel Bathory, ruled Transylvania and was actively involved in Hungary's independence movement against Habsburg rule. Gabriel even eyed the Hungarian throne, a direct threat to King Matthias. As a Protestant with significant land holdings, Elizabeth Bathory was caught in the crosshairs of these power struggles. The Habsburg court had ample motive to discredit the Bathory family. Undermining Elizabeth's reputation would neutralize her political influence. Not only that, but it would also indirectly weaken her ambitious Transylvanian relatives. Indeed, contemporaneous records show that Matthias II had a very concrete incentive to move against her. The king owed Elizabeth an extremely large sum of money. Notably, after Bathory's arrest, that royal debt was conveniently cancelled. This suspicious detail suggests that eliminating Bathory was financially advantageous for the crown. Elizabeth Bathory was not an obscure figure to contemporaries. She was born into one of the most illustrious families of Central Europe. The Bathory family had been major players in Hungarian and Transylvanian history since the 13th century. Her lineage included numerous princes of Transylvania, though this was a small-time role compared to the status of her uncle. This uncle, Stephen Bathory, was the elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1576 to 1586. Raised a Calvinist Protestant, young Elizabeth received an excellent education for a woman of her time and was noted to be intelligent and strong-willed. At age 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another influential Hungarian dynasty. Nadasdy was a famed soldier celebrated for his battles against the Ottomans, earning the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary amongst his Turkish foes. Through this marriage, Elizabeth's social standing grew even higher, and the couple acquired a vast network of estates, including multiple castles, throughout Hungary. The couple controlled vast estates in Hungary, including the castle of Chaktice, which became Elizabeth's primary residence. They had several children together and lived in considerable wealth and privilege. When Ferenc Nadasdy died in 1604, Elizabeth became a widowed countess in her mid-40s, suddenly assuming sole control of the enormous combined estate. This made her one of the wealthiest landowners in Hungary. It was after her husband's death that dark rumors about Elizabeth's treatment of her servants began to spread more widely. Importantly, Bathory's status as a propertied widow also made her vulnerable. Her position was envied by other nobles, including her own kin. Indeed, there is evidence that some of Elizabeth's sons-in-law, who stood to inherit parts of her estate, were eager to control her lands and wealth. Thus, both the Habsburg authorities and elements of her extended family had something to gain from bringing Elizabeth Bathory down. The stage was set for what many historians now believe was a coordinated effort to remove the Countess and redistribute her riches under the guise of a criminal prosecution. The case against Elizabeth Bathory officially began in 1610, when complaints about the disappearance of young women in the area around Chaktice Castle could no longer be ignored. Locals whispered that peasant girls who went to work at the Countess's castle were never seen again. By late 1610, King Matthias II had ordered an investigation, which Palatine Georgi Thurzo undertook with zeal. According to the later trial records, Thurzo collected testimony from around 300 witnesses who alleged all manner of horrors. They told stories of girls being kidnapped or lured to the castle, then tortured by Bathory. Accounts spoke of beatings, burnings, and other even more ghastly tortures. When this evidence didn't prove convincing enough, these rumors grew to include even higher-born victims. Several minor noblewomen who had been entrusted to Bathory's care for etiquette training were said to have been eliminated by the Countess as well. It was this detail, that daughters of the gentry might have been among the victims, that finally prompted authorities to act decisively. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo raided Elizabeth's castle and arrested her along with 4 of her servants, who were alleged accomplices. A letter by Thurzo claims that upon arriving, he caught her red-handed, with her prey in the castle. In truth, however, this dramatic account appears to have been an embellishment for effect. Contemporary evidence indicates Bathory was actually having dinner when Thurzo arrived, not in the midst of torturing anyone. The quote-unquote prey girl found alive in the castle recovered from whatever had happened to her and never testified about any violations. Bathory herself was never given a trial, an extraordinary violation of the usual legal process, considering her rank. Thurzo and Bathory's relatives quickly agreed that she would be kept under house arrest, avoiding the spectacle of a public trial that could tarnish the noble family names. This also conveniently prevented Elizabeth from speaking in her own defense before any court. In early January 1611, 2 judicial proceedings were held to prosecute Bathory's servants. The servants, 2 older women, Dorothea Sentes and Ilona Yo, a younger woman, Katerina Benica, and a teenaged boy, Janos Uvari, were accused of being accomplices. Under torture themselves, these servants confessed to participating in the slayings of dozens of girls at Bathory's behest. The court found them guilty, and 3 were executed in a particularly brutal fashion. The 4th servant, Katerina, was spared execution and given life imprisonment, as the court believed she had been coerced by the others. Notably, I find this logic a little bit unusual. As if true, they were all asked to participate in these acts by the most powerful person in their world. Elizabeth Bathory, meanwhile, was simply kept locked in a set of rooms of her own castle. She would remain confined there for the rest of her life until her death in 1614. The evidence used to condemn Elizabeth Bathory has been a subject of growing skepticism. A close look reveals that the case was shockingly weak by modern standards, relying on hearsay, rumor, and coerced confessions. Although some 300 witnesses were interviewed, none of them claimed to have actually seen the Countess or her accomplices do anything. In fact, not a single alleged victim ever gave testimony. All the stories were second or third-hand accounts of what I heard happened at the castle. Many witnesses had been primed by local gossip before testifying. Some have suggested that Thurzo's men had spread the horrific rumors in each village to ensure everyone knew the narrative by the time they were questioned. Unsurprisingly, the testimonies were inconsistent, with different people citing wildly different numbers of victims. Some spoke of a dozen dead, others dozens or hundreds. The most sensational claim of all is that Elizabeth's body count was 650 individuals. This came from a witness who said that one of Bathory's estate administrators had seen such a number written in the Countess's private diary. Crucially, this mysterious diary was never produced as evidence, nor was its supposed witness able to confirm the story under oath. In short, the dramatic number of 650 victims was nothing more than unverified hearsay. By contrast, when Elizabeth's 4 servants were interrogated, the total number of victims they could come up with was 36. Furthermore, we have no record of any contemporaneous complaints or petitions from peasants regarding missing daughters or mistreatment by the Countess. In that era, it was common for villagers to send written complaints to the authorities even for minor offenses, so the absence of a paper trail alleging true evil is noteworthy. The picture that emerges is that the physical evidence of Bathory's guilt was scant. It was customary at the time for large estates to function partly as infirmaries. As a large landlord, Bathory was responsible for providing medical care to servants and tenants. Some of the quote-unquote torture described by witnesses may have actually been misunderstood accounts of primitive medical treatments like cauterization or bleeding sick patients. These procedures were gruesome by our standards, but were legitimate remedies for serious illness in the 17th century. It is easy to see how a superstitious witness, primed by terrifying rumors, might mistake a medical intervention on a dying plague victim for an act of torture. Ever since the 1980s, historians have revisited the Elizabeth Bathory case and cast doubt on the traditional accounts. What they have uncovered strongly suggests that Bathory was not a vampiric monster, but rather the target of a deliberate character assassination. As noted, King Matthias had obvious financial and political motives to remove Bathory, and he entrusted the task to Georgi Thurzo, who also stood to gain. The cooperation of Elizabeth's kin in her prosecution further hints at familial betrayal. Her 2 sons-in-law helped Thurzo quietly imprison her, likely angling to claim parts of her estate for themselves. Indeed, after Elizabeth was safely locked away, an agreement was reached to divide her vast lands among her family, ensuring the Habsburg crown couldn't seize everything. However, the Habsburgs did seize portions of the land and did succeed in breaking up the vast estates into smaller, easier controlled estates. Further, The Habsburgs drastically increased the land holdings of the Catholic nobility in Hungary and Transylvania to the detriment of the Protestant nobility. But let's get back to Elizabeth Bathory and discuss the most lurid claim against her. The most famous aspect of her story suggests that she preferred to bathe in the blood of virgins for the purpose of preserving her youth. This detail was first popularized in the 18th century by Jesuit writers over a century after Bathory's death as a sensational morality tale during the Counter-Reformation. Those later retellings were part of a broader effort to portray Protestant nobles as depraved, which further indicates how Bathory's story was co-opted for propaganda. Further, it was co-opted amongst those who believed that women shouldn't hold power in their own right, with the implication that Bathory resorted to sick acts to satisfy her vanity. In other words, the bloodbath legend is almost certainly fiction grafted onto her name long after she could defend herself. Notably, despite the extremely lurid accusations made against Bathory by Habsburg officials and in the trials of her accomplices, this detail was never even hinted at. Had there been any inkling of potential vampiric involvement, it stands to reason that the authorities would have brought this up in the trials. Today, the academic consensus is that Elizabeth Bathory's evil reputation far exceeds the probable reality of her life. While she may have been a harsh ruler, perhaps even guilty of inflicting punishment or cruelty on some servants, there's no reliable evidence for the most disturbing accusations against her.